Imagine you are standing alone in the Rocky Mountains in 1831. The nearest town is 400 miles behind you. The nearest doctor is further than that. The temperature drops below zero every night, and something is moving through the trees just beyond the firelight. You have no phone, no backup, no law within any meaningful distance. All you have is what hangs from your belt. The mountain men who worked the North American fur trade between 1810 and 1850 lived inside that reality every single day. They were not soldiers following orders or settlers protected by forts. They were independent operators. Trading companies hired guns and private trappers who pushed into territory no map had ever charted, survived encounters no guidebook could prepare them for, and came back out, if they came back at all, because of the weapons they carried. 4 states banned some of these weapons before the Civil War even started. Others were compared by lawmakers to walking the streets with a loaded cannon in your coat pocket. One was so feared that its mere presence in a man's hand was enough to get him charged with premeditated murder, regardless of what actually happened. And one, the one at number 1 on this list, was never left behind. Not once. Not by a single mountain man worth his salt. These are the 25 weapons that kept mountain men alive in country where survival was a daily negotiation and violence could arrive from any direction without warning. Number 25. The Rawhide Sling. Before you picture a child's toy, stop. This was a weapon with a verified track record stretching back thousands of years. A braided leather strap with a small cradle at its center, capable of hurling a smooth river stone at speeds exceeding 90 miles per hour, with no sound, no powder, and no flash to betray your position. Mountain men adopted it because it was the most weight-efficient weapon they had ever encountered. A river stone weighed almost nothing. The sling weighed nothing. Ammunition covered the ground beneath your feet from the Missouri River to the Continental Divide. When a rifle shot echoed through a canyon for miles and announced your presence to every enemy within earshot, a sling stone dropped a man silently and left no trace. Trappers who wintered with Crow and Shoshone bands learned the overhead release and sidearm whip from men who had been perfecting it for generations. Spanish colonial law in the American Southwest actually prohibited indigenous peoples from carrying slings within settlement boundaries, recognizing it not as a primitive curiosity, but as a genuine threat. Number 24. The neck knife. Your rifle can be knocked from your hands, your belt knife torn from its sheath. Your pistol can misfire in temperatures that freeze the mechanism solid. In the chaos of a grizzly attack or a surprise assault, the weapons you can reach in the first half second are the only weapons that matter. The neck knife was the mountain man's answer. A short fixed blade, 3 to 4 inches of sharpened steel, hung on a leather thong beneath the buckskin shirt. Nobody saw it. Nobody knew it was there. Hugh Glass, mauled nearly to death by a grizzly in 1823 and abandoned by companions who took his rifle and every supply he had, became the era's most instructive lesson. Keep a blade where nobody thinks to look. Several states eventually classified neck knives as concealed weapons, making carrying one a jailable offense. The mountain man did not lose sleep over what Virginia thought about his backup blade. He cared about being alive to read the verdict. Number 23. The weighted throwing stick. Long before Europeans arrived with their powder horns and percussion caps, the peoples of the Great Plains had developed a throwing weapon so effective it never truly went away. a heavy piece of curved hardwood, balanced for aerodynamic stability, thrown with a sidearm release that sent it spinning in a flat, devastating arc. At 20 yards, it could shatter a deer's leg or crack the skull of a wolf circling camp at first light. No metal to rust, no edge to dull, no flint to shatter in cold weather. Some trappers carved their own from Osage orange, one of the densest woods on the continent, so hard frontier builders used it for wagon wheel hubs that outlasted iron fasteners. Beyond the tree line, where the laws of physics mattered more than any territorial ordinance, the throwing stick stayed in active circulation for the entire mountain man era. Number 22. The boot knife. When the rifle is empty, the belt knife gone, the pistol already fired, and your opponent has you on the ground, you still have options. If you planned ahead to put steel somewhere unexpected, mountain men favored blades between 4 and 6 inches, slim enough to slide into a sheath sewn inside a tall moccasin without a visible bulge, but substantial enough to drive through a buffalo hide coat. The double-edged versions were particularly effective because when fighting from the ground in the dark, you do not always have time to orient the blade before driving it forward. Virginia, Louisiana, and Tennessee named boot knives specifically in concealed weapon statutes by the 1850s. The distinction those laws tried to draw between self-defense and assassination would have struck any experienced trapper as dangerously naive. In a midnight raid, honest and desperate meant precisely the same thing. Number 21. The blackjack. Not every threat came from grizzlies or Blackfoot raiders. Some of it came from other mountain men. The annual rendezvous gathered thousands of trappers, traders, and Native American bands in mountain valleys. Furs exchanged for supplies, the remainder spent in activities ranging from athletic competitions to whiskey-fueled arguments over trap lines and gambling debts. Killing a fellow white man at rendezvous brought consequences that killing a bear did not, which created a specific demand for a weapon that could end a confrontation without ending the other man's life. A palm-sized leather pouch filled with lead shot. One sharp strike to the temple dropped a man cold. He woke up with a headache and a clear memory of why that argument was a bad idea. Nearly every state eventually outlawed the blackjack by name. In the 1820s, tucked into a possibles bag alongside fire-starting materials, it was simply common sense carried in leather. Number 20. The trade tomahawk. Blacksmiths from St. Louis to Fort Union forged these by the thousands. Lightweight hatchets with a blade on one face and a hollowed pipe bowl on the other, creating a combination weapon, camp tool, and smoking instrument that a mountain man used practically every hour of the day. It split firewood, drove tent stakes, butchered elk, and when a fight materialized from any direction, the same instrument splitting kindling 30 minutes earlier could be thrown to plant its edge in a tree trunk at 10 paces or buried in an opponent's shoulder before he raised his own weapon. Jim Bridger reportedly carried the same tomahawk for more than a decade, the handle worn smooth as river stone. When frontier towns established ordinances and the trade tomahawk appeared in prohibited weapons lists, the mountain men who had carried it for survival were already gone. They would not have been impressed by the reclassification. Number 19. The pepperbox revolver. Samuel Colt's revolving pistol did not achieve its iconic status until the 1840s. In the early mountain man era, the question of multiple shots in a single handgun was answered by a considerably more temperamental solution, a cluster of 4 to 6 individual barrels rotated around a central pin, each preloaded, bringing one into alignment with each trigger pull. The pepper box was wildly inaccurate beyond 10 feet and prone to chain fire. Powder from one barrel communicating flame to the others, causing all remaining barrels to discharge at once. Mark Twain said it was a weapon that couldn't hit anything in particular, but would fetch everything in general. Men who had survived chain fire at close range were considerably less amused. But in the confined chaos of a trading post brawl, the ability to deliver multiple shots without reloading was genuinely decisive. A typical trapper heading into the Rockies in the 1830s carried at minimum a belt knife, a trade tomahawk, a flintlock pistol, a possibles bag, and a powder horn. Many added a second pistol, a blackjack, and a neck knife tucked inside the shirt. All of it hung from a single wide leather belt, total weight exceeding 15 pounds, carried every single day. Painters like Alfred Jacob Miller, who traveled with fur trade expeditions in 1837, documented mountain men bristling with weapons at every angle. Every ounce was deliberate. Not paranoid men, experienced men. And experience in the Rocky Mountains meant understanding exactly how narrow the margin between a normal afternoon and a catastrophic one actually was. Number 17. The Arkansas toothpick. If the Bowie knife was the broadsword of the frontier, the Arkansas toothpick was its rapier. Long, narrow, double-edged, tapered to a needle point, of near surgical precision, designed with a purpose so specific that even lawmakers had difficulty pretending otherwise, piercing the human body at depth. A 12-inch blade could reach vital anatomy through layers of buffalo robe and winter clothing that would stop a shorter blade entirely. Tennessee banned the sale and transfer of Arkansas toothpicks in 1838, weeks after 2 state legislators resolved a disagreement with Bowie knives on the actual floor of the statehouse, leaving one dead. Lawmakers named it specifically in statutes across the South and West, treating it as a concealed sword. The mountain man treated it as insurance. Something you hoped you never needed. Something you absolutely had to have when you did. Number 16. The belt pistol. Not the mountain man's primary weapon. Barely accurate past 20 feet, slow to reload, never meant for distance or duels. But in the particular crisis it was built for. A sudden threat at near contact range when a rifle could not be brought to bear. It was the difference between a narrow escape and an unmarked grave. Smart trappers matched their pistol's caliber to their rifle, so a single bullet mold served both weapons. Jedediah Smith carried an English-made flintlock with a .62 caliber bore now preserved at the Cody Firearms Museum. Smith survived ordeals that would have been the defining catastrophe of any other man's life. Not through luck, but because he understood his equipment completely and never trusted any piece of it beyond what the situation warranted. Number 15. The slungshot. The name sounds diminutive, and it was neither. A heavy ball of lead or iron wrapped in leather, attached to a length of flexible cord. You held one end, swung the weighted end in an arc, and released it with force. Sailors had carried variations for centuries before it appeared in the mountain man's arsenal, and it traveled inland with rivermen pushing up the Missouri into trapping territory. A strike through a fur hat produced bone-deep results, regardless of what was layered between weapon and skull. By the 1870s, nearly every state had banned the slungshot by name. In the 1820s, it fit in a coat pocket and required no maintenance. For many trappers, that was justification enough. Number 14. The bush dagger. 4 states banned it before 1860 and called it an assassination weapon, a characterization that tells you exactly how it had been used. A short, wide blade, sometimes as short as 2 inches, mounted perpendicular to a T-shaped handle, fitting inside the closed fist. In a grappling fight with no room to swing or slash, a conventional knife becomes hard to deploy. The bush dagger required nothing beyond the same motion as a punch. Fist closed around the handle, blade extended between the fingers, every strike a stab. Mountain men carried variations into the field, some commercial, others improvised from broken trap springs by smiths who understood what was being requested without being told. The states that banned it called it a tool of pure surprise attack. Mountain men who had faced a war party in the dark would have found that characterization narrow. When swinging a longer blade was physically impossible, the bush dagger was not an assassination weapon. It was the reason they were alive to read the charges. Number 13. Brass knuckles. A blacksmith at any trading post could produce a functional set from scrap brass in under an hour at almost no cost. What it returned? The ability to turn an ordinary punch into a strike capable of fracturing a jawbone made it one of the most cost-effective pieces in the trapper's arsenal. At Rendezvous, where physical competition established the informal hierarchies governing communities without formal legal structure, brass knuckles were the equalizer for men who understood that not every opponent would be smaller or slower. The most sophisticated versions combined knuckle protection with a short integrated blade, a knuckle duster knife that could punch and cut in a single motion, eliminating the need to choose between options mid-confrontation. Arkansas, Texas, and Tennessee all banned them by name in now the same sessions that targeted Bowie knives and bush daggers. Number 12. The Hawken rifle. If you walked into the mountains between 1820 and 1850 and met a trapper coming the other way, the odds were better than even that he was carrying a Hawken. Jacob and Samuel Hawken began producing rifles in their St. Louis shop in 1815, and within a decade had built something that defined an era. A shorter, heavier, large-bore percussion rifle engineered for the Rocky Mountain fur trade. Calibers ranged from 45 to 68, powerful enough to drop a buffalo at 200 yards or stop a charging grizzly if the shooter held his nerve long enough for the shot that mattered. Kit Carson carried one. Jim Bridger carried one. 44 mountain men purchased Hawken rifles between 1831 and 1840 at $20 to $25. Significant when a successful trapper might earn $400 in a good year. No man who bought one regretted the expense. The men who did not occasionally regretted the saving. Mountain men rarely traveled alone. The standard unit of the fur trade was the brigade. 30 to 60 men organized by fur trading companies, moving through territory where individual travel was effectively suicidal. Their primary human adversary was the Blackfoot Confederacy. Sophisticated military operators who understood terrain, timing, and tactics, and who killed more mountain men than any other single cause during the trapping era. Every weapon on this list was carried by men who didn't treat violence as an abstract possibility, but as a practical certainty that could arrive from any direction at any moment. Number 10. The sword cane. It solved a specific problem mountain men faced when entering civilized spaces: how to carry effective weaponry, where openly wearing a tomahawk would complicate commercial transactions. In appearance, indistinguishable from an ordinary walking stick. In function, a blade between 18 and 24 inches concealed inside a hollowed shaft, deployable in under a second through a sharp twist. A man carrying one in the streets of St. Louis appeared to be a gentleman with a walking aid. He was carrying a blade longer than most of the knives that frontier laws explicitly prohibited. Virginia and Louisiana banned sword canes by name, while in those same states a man could openly wear a Bowie knife on his belt without issue. The sword cane was illegal precisely because nobody could see it. The Bowie knife was legal precisely because everyone could. The distinction made sense only in a world where threatening others openly was considered more acceptable than protecting yourself quietly. Number 9. The skinning knife, the mountain man's paycheck. A short curved blade between 3 and 5 inches, designed to separate beaver pelts from carcasses. The entire economic justification for everything else on this list. Its indispensability meant legislators could never target it without destroying the industry that sustained regional economies. What they did not account for was the anatomical knowledge that years of skinning produced. A mountain man who had processed thousands of hides understood musculature, connective tissue, and major blood vessels with a precision most physicians of the era could not match. The skinning knife was maintained at near surgical sharpness because a dull blade damaged pelts and cost money. In the hands of a 10-year veteran, it was by most practical measures one of the deadliest weapons on this list, not because of its size, but because of the expertise behind it. Number 8. The sawed-off shotgun, the frontier's answer to the ambush. Mountain men moving along river routes traveled through terrain where dense brush could conceal a threat at arm's length until the moment of contact. Rifles handled distance. Pistols handled single targets. Neither suited the scenario where 3 men stepped from a thicket 12 feet away, and the outcome of the next 2 seconds determined everything. The sawed-off double barrel, cut to 18 inches and loaded with buckshot, solved that problem with brutal directness. A single discharge spread wide enough to hit multiple targets simultaneously. The second barrel provided immediate backup. When both were empty, the shortened stock became a club. The sawed-off was also among the first firearms to attract specific legislative attention on barrel length, because its intended purpose had become impossible to misread. Number 7. The Green River knife, named for a factory in Greenfield, Massachusetts, that stamped blades near the hilt with the words Green River, a marking that gave the frontier one of its most visceral expressions. Mountain men who drove a Green River blade all the way to the stamp, fully embedded to the hilt, gave rise to a phrase that spread through trapper culture and into wider American slang. Give it to him up to Green River. The knife itself was a working blade, heavy, slightly curved, 6 to 10 inches, maintainable to shaving sharpness on a wet river stone in 5 minutes. It was not designed for fighting, but in the Rocky Mountains, the line between work and combat blurred constantly. Green River knives ended arguments over stolen horses, settled gambling debts, and resolved trapline disputes in the permanent manner that the absence of courts sometimes demanded. The knife was never outlawed. The phrase it inspired tells you everything about how it was actually used. Number 6. The war club. By the time a mountain man reached for his war club, essentially everything else had already happened. Rifles empty, pistols fired, tomahawk thrown, belt knife broken or gone, adopted from Plains Indian allies and adversaries alike. Which tells you exactly who mountain men paid closest attention to when evaluating combat effectiveness. The war club was a stone the size of a closed fist, wrapped tightly in rawhide and lashed to a wooden handle between 18 and 24 inches. The rawhide shrank as it dried, gripping the stone with tension that couldn't be broken without cutting it. Some trappers embedded trade knife blades through the stone head, creating something that could crush and cut in a single motion. In a camp overrun at night, when rifles could not be reloaded in darkness and pistols had already been discharged, the war club was what mountain men were still swinging when everything else was gone. Number 5. The Bowie knife, the weapon that generated more American legislation than any other blade ever forged. In September of 1827, on a sandbar near Natchez, Mississippi, a duel dissolved into a mass brawl. James Bowie was shot twice, stabbed twice, and beaten with an empty pistol before he drove a large butcher-style knife into his primary attacker, with enough force to end that man's participation in the fight. Bowie walked away with wounds that should have been fatal, and the knife became a national sensation overnight. The original blade measured 9¼ inches, single-edged with a clipped point usable for thrusting. As the name spread, manufacturers produced versions in every size. Mountain men carried Bowies from 8 to 15 inches, long enough to butcher an elk, strong enough to pry open a frozen pack, imposing enough that placing your hand on the handle communicated something unambiguous to whoever was watching. Alabama imposed a $100 tax on ownership in 1837 and decreed anyone who killed a man while carrying one would face premeditated murder charges regardless of circumstances. Tennessee made drawing one in public a felony. Texas banned carry on one's person in 1871. None of it mattered. The Bowie remained the most carried weapon of the mountain man era, from St. Louis to the Pacific, on the belt of every man who could afford one. Here is what lawmakers never understood. You could not separate the mountain man from his weapons any more than you could separate a surgeon from his scalpel. The Bowie butchered the elk that fed the camp for 3 days. The tomahawk split the firewood that kept it from freezing. When legislators hundreds of miles from the nearest significant elevation passed statutes banning these objects, they were not regulating armaments. They were attempting to legislate against a way of life that had no interest in their opinion. The mountain men were gone before the ink was dry on most of those laws, and the country they explored, mapped, and bled across became the foundation of everything that came after. Number 3. The Derringer pistol. Henry Derringer of Philadelphia began producing his pocket pistols in the 1820s, and the weapon he built occupied a space no other firearm could fill. It was the one nobody saw coming, a barrel of 3 to 4 inches, a bore of .41 caliber, accurate at arm's length, precisely where it was intended to be used, and it disappeared completely. In an era when every serious man in the West carried visible weapons, the Derringer was the piece that sat in the sash, the boot top, or the inside coat pocket, untouched and unannounced, available for exactly the moment when all visible defenses had already been tested and found insufficient. Lawmakers compared it to carrying a loaded cannon in your coat pocket, not because of its firepower, which was modest, but because of its combination of lethality and invisibility. John Wilkes Booth's use of a derringer in April of 1865 cemented its reputation permanently. For the mountain men who had carried them 30 years earlier, it had simply been the last card in a hand that nobody outside the immediate situation ever needed to know they were holding. Number 2. The dirk. The dirk arrived in North America in the luggage of Scottish Highland immigrants who brought a tradition of personal armament predating the United States by centuries, a straight, double-edged stabbing blade between 8 and 12 inches, with a crossguard protecting the hand, designed for the specific application of driving the blade forward into another person's body. It was not a cutting tool repurposed as a weapon. It was a weapon. That was all it had ever been. The crossguard prevented the hand from sliding onto the blade when force was applied. The double edge meant there was no orientation in which the knife was not actively cutting tissue. Dirks appear in more concealed weapon statutes than any other knife in American legal history. Virginia, Louisiana, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Texas all banned them specifically by name, not as a category, but as this specific design, in this specific configuration. The frequency with which legislators named the dirk reflects the frequency with which it appeared in the injury and fatality reports that preceded those laws. For the Scottish heritage mountain men who carried their grandfathers' dirks into the Rockies, no territorial statute carried more weight than the blade itself. And that brings us to number 1, the war tomahawk. Not the trade tomahawk at number 20. Not the utility hatchet with the pipe bowl that Jim Bridger wore smooth from daily use. The war tomahawk, heavier, longer, purpose-built by frontier blacksmiths who had studied what close combat in the Rocky Mountains actually demanded and engineered accordingly. The head carried more mass than the trade version, producing more force on contact through multiple layers of winter buffalo hide. The handle ran 20 to 24 inches, extending both reach and leverage. The blade edge was maintained at a sharpness the utility version rarely achieved. Some blacksmiths added a spike on the reverse face, creating a tool that could penetrate bone from behind, hook around an arm to pull an opponent off balance, or pry a weapon from a hand gripping it with the strength that mortal fear produces. In experienced hands, the war tomahawk was the most tactically versatile close combat weapon in the frontier arsenal. It could be thrown with lethal accuracy at 15 paces, released in a flat arc that rotated half a turn to bring the blade forward on impact. It could be used single-handed, paired with a belt knife in the offhand, a fighting style several mountain men developed into a personal signature. The curved beard of some designs allowed the user to hook an opponent's weapon or forearm and drag them off balance, creating an opening that a knife could immediately exploit. And it delivered killing force from angles a blade simply could not reach. Overhead, behind, around obstacles, from positions where a knife required more time than the situation permitted. It was also the mountain man's primary camp tool, used every single day. The same head that flew into a tree trunk at 10 paces, split the firewood that cooked every meal, drove tent stakes into frozen ground, and cleared brush through a dozen daily tasks that would have otherwise required separate tools. The war tomahawk was not a fighting weapon that happened to be useful in camp. It was a complete survival instrument that also happened to be one of the most dangerous close combat tools ever developed for the North American wilderness. No mountain man ever left it behind. Frontier ordinances banned it. Eastern lawmakers feared it. A century and a half of popular culture misrepresented it, turning it into a prop for savagery, rather than what it actually was. A precision instrument in the hands of men who had spent years learning to use it with care and efficiency that survival demanded. The men who carried the war, Tomahawk, understood something that 200 years of legislation have never changed. In country where the law cannot reach you, in conditions where no external authority will arrive in time, the only protection that means anything is the kind you carry with you. And of everything that mountain men strapped to their belts across those 40 years, all 25 weapons on this list, accumulated through experience, traded for, improvised, and carried across tens of millions of acres of unmapped continent. The war tomahawk was the one that was always there, the last line of every defense, the first choice in every emergency, the tool that built camp and, when necessary, ended the argument about whether camp would be built at all. These 25 weapons were not carried by men looking for violence. They were carried by men who understood that violence, in the world they had chosen, did not ask permission before arriving. The mountain man era lasted barely 40 years. From the first push into the Rockies in the early 1810s to the collapse of the beaver trade in the mid-1840s, when silk replaced felt in European hat manufacturing and rendered the entire enterprise irrelevant almost overnight. In that compressed window, these men explored more of Western North America than any military expedition, mapped more river systems than any government survey, and survived conditions that would challenge a modern operator equipped with satellite communication and emergency extraction. They did it with black powder and hand-forged steel and braided rawhide and river stones. Every weapon on this list served a function. Every ounce was justified. Drop a comment below, telling us which weapon you would want on your belt heading into the Rocky Mountains in 1830. The answer says something about how you think about preparation, risk, and what survival actually requires when the margin is that thin. And if you stayed with this one all the way to the end, you already know what to do next.